Mr. Madison's War. Road to War. From 1775 to 1783, Americans fought for their independence from Great Britain. When they won the Revolutionary War, Americans were finally free of British rule and interference, or so they thought. After the war, the relationship between the United States and Great Britain remained tense. Less than 30 years later, the two countries would again be at war. The War of 1812 to 1815, didn't last as long as the Revolutionary War. It didn't have as great of an impact on the country either, but it did affect how the U.S. government was run. It also affected where Americans lived and their relationship with American Indians. What issues and conflicts led the United States and Great Britain back to war? What caused the War of 1812? Several factors led the United States into war against Great Britain for the second time. Cause number one, American sailors forced into British service. On June 22, 1807, the USS Chesapeake set sail off the Virginia coast. Suddenly, the crew noticed that a British ship was chasing the Chesapeake. The other ship, the HMS Leopard, forced the Chesapeake to stop. The Leopard's captain, Salisbury Humphreys, demanded to come aboard the Chesapeake. U.S. Commander James Barron refused. The British began firing at the Chesapeake. The American crew fired one gun and scrambled to get off the ship. 18 men were injured, 3 were killed. The British took 4 men off the Chesapeake and forced them to work on the Leopard. The act of taking U.S. sailors off their ships and forcing them to work for Great Britain was called impressment. The British had been impressing sailors for several years before what became known as the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. Americans were furious about this practice and wanted it to stop. Cause number 2, U.S. expansion. In the late 1700s, the United States territory spread from the Atlantic Ocean west to the Mississippi River, but the country was eager to expand even further west. The United States had also had its eye on British-controlled Canadian territories to the north. This situation worried the British government. American Indians were also concerned. As white settlers moved west, they built farms and towns on land that the Indians used for hunting and trapping. The Indians didn't want settlers taking over more of their land. Indian leaders had to choose between being loyal to the United States or siding with the British. The Indians believed the British would be more likely to let them keep their land. Cause number 3, trade issues. By the early 1800s, the United States was still a young, growing country. It made money and brought in needed supplies by trading goods with other countries. These goods were transported by ship, but the U.S. shipping trade was caught in the middle of sea battles between Great Britain and France. The two countries were fighting for control of trade on the Atlantic Ocean and for land. France and Great Britain would block ships from reaching the other countries' ports. This action created major hardships for the United States. Americans couldn't make money by selling goods to France. Great Britain also caused trouble by stealing goods from the American ships. The U.S. government realized that this situation couldn't continue. The United States at war. President Thomas Jefferson tried to find peaceful solutions to the problems with Great Britain. After the Chesapeake Leopard affair, Jefferson asked Congress to pass the Embargo Act. This act prevented any ships from entering or leaving U.S. ports. It shut down U.S. trade. Jefferson thought the embargo would help the United States remain neutral in the war between France and Britain. But the act hurt the U.S. economy. The unpopular act lasted just 14 months. When James Madison became president in 1809, he also tried to avoid war. Like Jefferson, Madison stopped the United States from trading with Great Britain and France. but Madison allowed the United States to keep trading with other countries. This didn't work either. Great Britain continued to stop U.S. ships, steal their goods, and impress American sailors. Battle of Tippecanoe. A battle between American soldiers and American Indians finally led to the United States to war with Great Britain. On November 7, 1811, the Battle of Tippecanoe was fought near an Indian village called Prophetstown in northern Indiana. A Shawnee tribal leader named Tecumseh fought against white settlers moving into Indian lands. Tecumseh spent the summer and fall of 1811 traveling and spreading his message to other tribes. Before Tecumseh left, he warned his brother Tenskwatawa to avoid battle with the whites. William Henry Harrison was the governor of Indiana Territory. He worried about Tecumseh uniting the Indians against white settlers. On November 6, Harrison and about 1,000 troops set up camp near the village. Their plan was to attack Prophettown the next morning. Tenskwatawa knew the Americans were close by. He ignored his brother's warning and led an attack on the sleeping American soldiers. After 2 hours of fierce fighting, 62 American soldiers and about 50 American Indians were dead. War hawks. A group of young congressmen blamed Great Britain for the Battle of Tippecanoe. They believed the British encouraged the Indians to attack U.S. soldiers. These congressmen were called the War Hawks. They worked to convince President Madison that war was the best solution to the conflict with Britain. Madison listened to the War Hawks. On June 1, 1812, he presented Congress with a list of complaints against Great Britain. Madison was angry at Britain for impressing soldiers and interfering with trade. He also blamed Britain for worsening the United States' relationship with American Indians. On June 18, 1812, Congress declared war on Great Britain. Early battles. In July 1812, more than 6,000 British and Canadian soldiers and American Indians surrounded U.S. Fort Mackinac. The fort was on Mackinac Island in Michigan Territory. Lieutenant Porter Hanks, the head of Fort Mackinac, was shocked. He hadn't been told the United States was at war. Without any shots fired, Hanks surrendered. The United States lost an important path to Canada. On August 15th, U.S. soldiers and their family members evacuated Fort Dearborn in present-day Chicago. American Indians killed more than half of the people fleeing the fort. On August 16th, U.S. General William Hull surrendered his army at Fort Detroit in Michigan Territory. The war was not off to a good start for the United States. But the United States did have an important victory at sea. HMS War-9 off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada. After a half-hour battle, the War-9 was destroyed. This victory gave Americans confidence about the chance of winning the war. Burning the Capitol. In May 1814, Great Britain won its war with France. With that war over, about 15,000 more British soldiers were available to fight the United States. In mid-August, 4,500 British soldiers landed in Maryland. The U.S. Army realized the nation's capital was in danger. They gathered a force of about 6,000, mostly militia, on Bladensburg Road to fight 2,600 British troops on August 24th. Despite having more troops, the Americans were defeated. The British soldiers continued their march to Washington, D.C. When the British troops arrived in Washington, they set the U.S. Capitol on fire. Late in the evening, British troops reached the president's house and set it on fire. Key victories. Two more important battles happened in the fall of 1814. On September 6th, about 10,000 British troops reached Plattsburgh, New York, on the shores of Lake Champlain. 5 days later, a British fleet sailed to Plattsburgh. American naval and land forces awaited them. The two sides fired at each other for 2 hours and 20 minutes. In the end, the American forces won. On September 13th, Great Britain attacked Fort McHenry in Baltimore, Maryland. Unlike the attack on Washington, D.C., the United States was prepared for this battle. The British fired at Fort McHenry all day and night, but the fort suffered little damage. There were few American deaths. The Americans had successfully defended the fort. Peace talks and victory in New Orleans. In August 1814, American leaders, including Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, traveled to Ghent, Belgium, where the Americans began peace talks with British officials. Finally, a peace treaty was signed on December 24, 1814. Word traveled slowly in those days, so few people knew. Meanwhile, the British sailed towards New Orleans. British Secretary of War Henry Bathurst believed attacking New Orleans would help force the United States to surrender. British troops attacked the city on January 8, 1815. General Andrew Jackson led the American troops. The battle lasted only about 30 minutes. In that time, 2,000 British soldiers and 71 American soldiers were injured or killed. Most Americans heard about the U.S. victory in New Orleans before learning about the peace treaty. They thought this victory was the reason for the end of the war. What effects did the War of 1812 have? The British and the Americans celebrate the end of the war. Both had reasons to believe they had won. There were no clear winners in the War of 1812, but the war did cause some lasting effects in the young United States. Effect number 1, a lost way of life. Although it wasn't clear what the United States and Great Britain gained from the War of 1812, there was one group that lost a great deal. This group was the American Indians. The Treaty of Ghent said that American Indians' rights and lands would return to the way they were in 1811. But since Indian lands had no clear-cut boundaries, white Americans ignored this part of the treaty. Americans stopped expanding into Indian territory in Canada, but they didn't stop taking over the Indian territory in the United States. They pushed tribes off lands they had lived on for hundreds of years. Along with their land, Indians were forced to give up their traditions and their way of life. Effect number 2, continued confidence. Because the United States successfully defeated itself against Great Britain during the war, it gained the respect of other European countries. This boosted U.S. confidence and brought about a period called the Era of Good Feelings. The confidence encouraged the spirit of growth in the United States and continued throughout the 1800s. Effect number 3, economic growth. The American economy grew stronger after the war. The disruptions in trade before and during the war forced the United States to build more factories. The country became less dependent on goods from other countries. For example, many cotton mills were built in the eastern United States to produce cloth. Before the war, cotton cloth was brought in from Great Britain. Transportation system also expanded to send factory and mill products to other countries and U.S. regions. One of these systems was the Erie Canal. The canal connected the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes in 1825. Number 4, the U.S. political system. The Federalist and Democratic Republican political parties were powerful during and after the Revolutionary War. The Federalist Party strongly opposed the War of 1812. Federalists believed that a war against Great Britain wouldn't benefit the United States. After the war, many Americans believed that the Federalists weren't patriotic and didn't represent their needs. By 1816, the party had fallen apart because of lack of support. The breakdown of the Federalist Party allowed the rise of the Democrat. and Republican parties that we have in the United States today. Number 5, the national anthem. Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light. American lawyer Francis Scott Key wrote these familiar words after watching the British attack Fort McHenry. When Key awoke the morning after the battle, he saw an enormous American flag still flying over Fort McHenry. Key was so moved by what he saw, he wrote a poem. His poem was set to music and called The Star-Spangled Banner. In 1931, it became the national anthem. Cause and effect, shaping a country. The War of 1812 helped to shape today's United States. The war changed the American political system, economy, and land boundaries. It helped create a sense of national pride. The memory of the war lives on in the words we still sing. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Mr. Madison's War,